Lena stood by the riverbank, her gaze fixed on the once pristine waters, now reduced to a sluggish trickle. The river that had been the heart and soul of her small coastal town was drying up, and it felt like a piece of her childhood was slipping away with it. As a young girl, she had spent countless summer afternoons wading through the cool, clear water, catching minnows with her friends and watching the river swirl gently around the rocks. But now, the river seemed tired, as though it too was struggling to stay alive. The banks, once lined with vibrant greenery and wildflowers, had become barren, cracked earth stretching for miles. The familiar hum of the river's current, which had once filled the air, was now replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the dry reeds. The water, once teeming with life, now barely flowed, and what little was left was murky and stagnant. It was a sight Lena couldn't get used to, even though she had been watching it happen for years. As the town's lead environmental scientist, Lena had witnessed the gradual decline firsthand. Over the past few years, the river's water level had dropped steadily, month by month, season by season. The local farmers, who relied on the river for irrigation, had been hit the hardest. Crops that once flourished in the fertile soil by the river's edge had withered in the harsh, dry conditions. What had once been a flourishing agricultural hub was now becoming a desert, the land parched and barren. Lena adjusted the strap of her backpack and turned to survey the scene around her. In the distance, a group of farmers gathered near a makeshift well, arguing heatedly. They had to dig deeper and deeper just to get a few gallons of water, and even that wasn't enough. Lena's heart ached for them, but her frustration grew with each passing day. The government had been dismissive of their pleas for action, insisting that the changes in the river were simply part of a natural cycle. But Lena knew better. There had to be something more. For weeks, Lena and her team of researchers had been working on a global project mapping the rivers of the world. Their findings were startling. Rivers that once flowed freely were changing their courses or drying up entirely. From the Yangtze in China to the Colorado in the United States, the patterns were the same. Water levels were falling, and the ecosystems that depended on these rivers were collapsing. It wasn't just happening in her town, it was a global phenomenon. She pulled out a weathered map from her bag and unfurled it, tracing her finger over the world's rivers. The lines of the rivers, once so clear and continuous, now looked fragmented, broken. Lena's finger paused over a section where a river, one she knew well, had started to shift dramatically. The change was small, only a few meters on the map, but it was enough to devastate the surrounding area. Why? She whispered to herself, her mind racing. Why were these rivers changing, and what was causing it? Lena had heard the theories, the ones that the government and the media pushed. Some said it was just a result of global warming, the melting glaciers and erratic weather patterns altering the flow. Others blamed human interference, deforestation, and urban expansion. But Lena knew there was something else, something deeper. The patterns didn't align with what they were being told. The changes weren't just a consequence of warming temperatures or human greed. They seemed too deliberate, too precise. "Lena, you're looking at it again, aren't you?" A voice broke her concentration. She turned to see Tom, one of her colleagues, walking toward her. Tom had been with Lena since the start of the project. He was pragmatic, a little cynical, but always reliable. His eyes were narrowed in concern as he looked at the map in her hands. "I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong," Lena said, folding the map carefully and slipping it back into her bag. "The government isn't taking us seriously, Tom. They keep saying it's just natural changes. But this feels different. Tom raised an eyebrow. So, what do you think it is? Some kind of conspiracy? Lena shook her head. I don't know. But the more we map, the more I see patterns that don't fit. It's not just about the temperature rising or human activity. There's something happening on a larger scale. Tom sighed. You know, I've been hearing whispers about this for a while. I don't want to sound alarmist, but what if these changes aren't just natural or human-made? What if something's affecting the Earth's magnetic fields or the balance of the atmosphere itself? Lena's eyes widened. It wasn't an idea she had fully entertained, but it made a strange kind of sense. The weather patterns were shifting unpredictably, and the effects on the rivers were becoming more and more pronounced. Could it be that the Earth itself was undergoing a change? I think we need to get this data into the right hands, Lena said, determination creeping into her voice. We can't keep letting them dismiss this. The world needs to know what's really happening. As Lena walked back to the research station, her thoughts swirled like the turbulent waters she had studied for years. Every day, the river flowed less and less. It wasn't just the river that was in danger. It was everything. And the more Lena uncovered, the clearer it became. The disappearing waters were just the beginning. There was something much bigger at play, something the world wasn't ready for. The lights of the conference hall flickered as Lena stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. The Global Climate Research Conference was held annually, attracting the brightest minds from around the world, and this year, Lena had been chosen to present her findings. She took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone before her, and glanced at the sea of faces. Scientists, policymakers, environmental activists, and journalists, all waiting for her to speak. Behind her, the screen flickered to life, displaying a map of the world's rivers. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as Lena clicked to the next slide, the map shifted. Lines once solid and continuous, now curved, fragmented, and in some places disappeared altogether. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady, despite the nerves that coiled in her stomach. I'm Lena Winters, and today I'm here to share with you a disturbing pattern we've uncovered, a pattern that, I believe, signals a crisis in the making. The room fell silent as Lena advanced the slides, showing side-by-side comparisons of river paths from decades ago and today. The difference was undeniable. Many of the world's rivers were shifting direction or drying up completely. Some, like the once mighty Amazon, had started to split into several smaller channels. Others, like the Nile, had seen their water levels plummet to historically low levels. As you can see, Lena continued, pointing to a chart, this is not just a regional issue, it's a global one. We've mapped dozens of rivers, and in every case, the water levels are dropping. But more than that, the flow patterns are being altered in ways that can no longer be explained by climate change alone. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Lena moved on to the next slide, which showed an overlay of industrial zones, deforested regions, and pollution hotspots along the river courses. Industrial pollution and deforestation are, of course, major contributors to the degradation of our rivers, she said. But what we've also discovered, what's most alarming, is that these changes are happening in regions that haven't been heavily industrialized. And that's when we started to consider other factors. She clicked to the next slide, revealing a graph that charted shifts in the Earth's magnetic fields, which had been subtly but steadily changing over the past century. The patterns on the map seemed to match the river disruptions. Certain rivers that had been most affected also correlated with areas where the Earth's magnetic field was shifting more dramatically. These changes in the magnetic fields are small, but they're undeniable, Lena said, her voice more serious now. Could these shifts be influencing the behavior of the rivers? Could they be altering not just water flow, but the very way Earth's ecosystems function? This is a question that demands urgent attention. Lena paused, letting her words hang in the air as the audience digested her findings. She could see the looks of disbelief on some faces, the furrowed brows of skepticism, but there were also those who nodded, recognizing the gravity of her research. Before she could continue, a voice from the back of the room spoke up. Are you suggesting that the magnetic shifts are directly causing the rivers to change their course? And if so, what are the broader implications of this? Could the Earth's geological stability be at risk? Lena's eyes met the speaker's, an older man with sharp features and a serious demeanor. Dr. Arthur, a renowned geophysicist, was known for his no-nonsense approach to climate science. His question was the one Lena had anticipated, and she was ready for it. Yes, Dr. Arthur, I believe that's a possibility, Lena said, nodding. The Earth's magnetic field has always played a crucial role in stabilizing the planet's systems, everything from weather patterns to ocean currents. If the field is weakening or shifting in unexpected ways, it could be affecting more than just the rivers. We could be seeing the first signs of a much larger planetary-scale disturbance. The room erupted in murmurs. Some of the audience looked uneasy, while others leaned forward, intrigued. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. So, what can we do about it? She asked. If the problem is this vast, what steps can we take to address it? Lena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. That's the next step, she said. We need to figure out how these changes are interconnected, not just in terms of the rivers, but in the larger context of global climate shifts. We need to reframe our approach to environmental science. The rivers aren't isolated problems. They're part of a much bigger picture. Dr. Arthur stood up from his seat, his voice carrying across the room. I agree with Lena, he said. This could very well be the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about changes that go beyond temperature and weather patterns. If Lena's research is correct, we may be facing a crisis that threatens not just our rivers, but the stability of the entire planet. It's time for a new kind of research, a new kind of action. The room was alive with conversation now, a buzz of excitement and concern spreading through the audience. Lena could feel her heart racing, not just from the adrenaline of her presentation, but from the realization that something bigger was at stake. This wasn't just about saving rivers, it was about saving the Earth. After the session, as Lena made her way to the back of the conference hall, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Emma, one of her colleagues from the environmental group, standing there with a smile. You did it, Lena, Emma said. You really did it. They're listening. Lena smiled back, but the satisfaction didn't last long. It's not enough, she said, shaking her head. We need to do more than talk. We need to act and fast. The clock's ticking. As they walked out into the bustling lobby, Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The conference had sparked a wave of debate and concern, but it was just the beginning. Now, the real work began. She knew she had to keep pushing, keep uncovering the mysteries that lay beneath the surface. And this time, she wouldn't let the world ignore what was happening. The rivers, the earth, and the future itself depended on it. The dense, humid air of the Amazon rainforest pressed in on Lena as she stepped off the small boat and onto the muddy shore. Her boots sank into the earth as she walked carefully toward a narrow trail hidden beneath the thick canopy of trees. She had traveled far from her home, guided by whispers of a secret group, the River Guardians, a collective of scientists, indigenous people, and environmental activists who had dedicated their lives to tracking the health and flow of the world's rivers. Lena had come across mentions of them in obscure journals, in footnotes buried deep within ancient texts about river systems. But now, as she stood at the edge of the forest, the reality of her quest set in. She was about to meet a group of people who understood the rivers in ways she could only begin to fathom. They didn't just study the rivers, they revered them. The trail was narrow, winding between towering trees and vines, with the sounds of the jungle all around her, the distant calls of monkeys, the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush, the hum of insects. It was both serene and unnerving. She followed her guide, Javier, a tall man with deep-set eyes who had lived in the forest for most of his life. His skin was weathered from years under the sun, and his movements were sure and quiet, as though he belonged to the forest itself. After an hour of walking, they arrived at a clearing. There, hidden in the heart of the jungle, was a modest yet oddly serene compound made of wooden huts and open platforms. The structure was simple, yet it carried an air of ancient wisdom. As Lena stepped forward, she was greeted by an elderly woman with silver gray hair, her face lined with years of wisdom and experience. This was Isabel, the leader of the River Guardians. "Welcome, Lena," Isabel said, her voice low but warm. "We've been expecting you." Lena blinked in surprise. "You knew I was coming?" Isabel smiled softly. "The river has its ways of letting us know when we're needed." As Isabel led Lena into the compound, she could feel the energy shift. The Guardians weren't just preserving the river, they were connected to it in a way that seemed almost spiritual. The walls of the huts were lined with artifacts, ancient pottery, woven baskets, and worn maps, some of which looked centuries old. The air smelled of incense and herbs, mixing with the earthy scent of the jungle. Inside one of the larger huts, a fire crackled in the center, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A group of people gathered around, their faces illuminated by the warm glow. They were a mix of indigenous elders, scientists, and young activists, all united by a common purpose. Isabel motioned for Lena to sit by the fire. As she did, Javier placed a large bundle of old maps before her. "These are the maps of the ancient rivers," Isabel explained. "They tell a story of the earth that modern science has forgotten." Lena's eyes widened as she unrolled the first map. It was unlike anything she had seen before, hand-drawn, with intricate symbols and paths winding across continents. The rivers on these maps seemed alive, almost as though they had purpose. As she traced her finger over one of the rivers, Isabel spoke again. "Long before modern science understood the flow of water, our ancestors knew that rivers were not just channels of water. They were the lifeblood of the earth, guardians of balance, fertility, and life itself." Lena looked up, puzzled. "Guardians?" "Yes," Isabel continued. "The rivers were seen as sacred. They controlled the cycles of the land, bringing life to the soil, feeding the forests, and nourishing the creatures. They were not simply natural forces. They were spiritual entities, woven into the very fabric of the earth. Our people understood that to disrupt the rivers was to disrupt the balance of all life." Lena's mind raced as she looked back at the map. It wasn't just the courses of rivers that were marked, but also what seemed to be celestial alignments and patterns, constellations and moon phases that synchronized with the river's flow. "These maps suggest something cosmic," Lena murmured. Could the shifting of the rivers be tied to more than just Earth's natural changes? Isabel nodded gravely. The rivers are connected to the stars, to the moon, and to the heart of the earth. When the flow is disrupted, it's not only the land that suffers, so does the cosmos. The changes you are witnessing, the drying of rivers, their changing courses, are part of a larger disturbance. The balance is tipping. Lena sat back, absorbing this revelation. She had always believed that the rivers were vital to the Earth's health, but she had never considered their deeper cosmic role. Was it possible that the magnetic shifts she had uncovered were somehow connected to this ancient wisdom? Were the rivers, as the guardians suggested, part of a much larger spiritual and environmental balance? Before she could voice her thoughts, another member of the guardians, a young scientist named Marco, spoke up. He held a notebook in his hand, his eyes intense. "Lena," he said, "we've been tracking anomalies in the flow of the rivers for years. The shifts you're seeing, especially in the Amazon, are not just environmental changes. They are part of a disruption in the Earth's energetic system. What we've found is that the rivers themselves seem to be responding to something beyond human control, something greater than what we can comprehend with science alone." Lena's curiosity deepened. "What do you mean?" Marco opened his notebook and showed her a series of sketches, complex graphs of energy flow, magnetic fields, and river patterns. "Our data suggests that the rivers are not just physical entities. They are part of a living, interconnected system, and when the balance is disturbed, the rivers are spawned by shifting their paths, drying up, or even reversing course." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about pollution or climate change. It was something far more intricate, more profound. The very nature of the earth was being altered, and the rivers were at the center of it. "We've been tracking the cosmic cycles," Isabel added softly, "and we believe the time is coming when the rivers will reclaim their role as guardians of life. But only if we can help restore the balance. That's why you're here, Lena. Your research, the data you've collected, it is vital. We need to unite science with ancient knowledge to understand how to heal the rivers and restore the balance before it's too late." Lena looked around at the guardians, their faces filled with a mixture of determination and hope. For the first time, she realized that her journey wasn't just about documenting changes. It was about becoming part of something far bigger than herself. The rivers weren't just flowing through the earth. They were flowing through time, through the universe, and through the very heart of life itself. And Lena, now more certain than ever, knew that her mission had just become much larger than she had ever imagined. The air grew thin as Lena and Dr. Arthur made their way up the winding mountain road. The landscape around them was vast and wild, with jagged peaks stretching into the sky and dense forests clinging to the slopes below. Their destination, a secluded research facility buried deep in the mountains, a place that housed some of the world's most cutting-edge data on Earth's electromagnetic fields. The facility, known as Helios Base, was only accessible by a winding, narrow road, making it one of the most secretive research centers in the world. Lena had been traveling for days, following the trail of information about the mysterious shifts in the Earth's magnetic field. After their intense discussions at the climate conference, Dr. Arthur had suggested they visit the facility. The data collected there could be the missing piece of the puzzle. As their vehicle rumbled along the rocky path, Lena glanced at Dr. Arthur. He was quiet, his sharp eyes fixed on the road ahead, but she could tell his mind was racing. The news they had uncovered in the past few weeks had been unsettling: shifts in the magnetic poles, disturbances in the flow of rivers, and, most troubling of all, a connection between these events and something far more cosmic in nature. Finally, they arrived at the gates of Helios Base. The facility was a sleek, modern complex built into the mountainside, its reflective glass walls blending seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. Security was tight. Armed guards and surveillance cameras were positioned at every corner, keeping watch over the remote area. But as Dr. Arthur flashed his credentials, they were granted access. Inside the facility, the atmosphere was sterile and high-tech. The walls were lined with advanced equipment, supercomputers, monitoring stations, and holographic displays flickered with data. The place smelled of clean air, metal, and electronics. They were escorted by a young scientist named Eva, who led them through the facility's maze of corridors to a large, circular room in the center of the building. This was the heart of Helios Base, the Magneto Research Chamber. It was a large, open space filled with towering monitors, magnetic field generators, and high-powered telescopes focused on the stars. At the center of the room was a giant spherical screen hovering in the air. As Ava tapped a few keys, the screen illuminated, revealing a three-dimensional model of Earth, its magnetic field displayed as a glowing web of energy lines stretching across the globe. "This is what we've been tracking for the past few years," Eva said, her voice calm but serious. "The magnetic poles are shifting faster than we anticipated. The changes are occurring at an accelerating rate." Lena stepped closer, her breath catching as she observed the model. The energy lines that normally formed a stable grid around the Earth were now warping, bending, and breaking apart in certain areas. The poles were moving, their positions unstable, and the flow of energy from the core of the Earth seemed to be disturbed. Dr. Arthur leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the data. "These shifts, they're not just random, they're becoming more erratic, almost as if something is forcing the poles to move faster than they should." Lena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Could this be connected to the changes in the rivers?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eva nodded gravely. "We think so. The magnetic field affects everything from weather patterns to ocean currents. But more importantly, it influences the flow of the Earth's energy, a flow that is deeply interconnected with natural systems like rivers." Dr. Arthur turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "When the poles shift, the energy flow through the Earth changes. This could disrupt the river systems, their courses, their water levels, and their ability to maintain the ecosystems that depend on them. But this is just the beginning." Lena's mind raced as she tried to connect the dots. The rivers were not just lifelines of water. They were, in a sense, conduits of energy, carrying the Earth's vital forces across the landscape. If the magnetic field was disturbed, could it be influencing the flow of energy in the rivers as well? Eva continued, "We've also noticed something strange. The rate at which the poles are shifting correlates with disturbances in the flow of rivers in certain areas. For example, the Amazon River, one of the most stable and oldest river systems in the world, has been changing course in unexpected ways. And it's not just the physical environment that's being affected. The biological systems are collapsing." Lena's thoughts raced. "The ecosystems? You're saying they're collapsing because of the magnetic shifts?" "Yes," Ava replied. "The energy patterns that maintain the balance of life in these ecosystems are being disturbed. The rivers are not just bodies of water. They are part of a larger energy system that sustains life on Earth. If the rivers are altered, the entire ecosystem collapses, and we are seeing that happen. Dr. Arthur stepped back, his eyes filled with concern. What we're seeing is a cosmic disruption, something on a planetary scale. The shifts in the magnetic poles are more than just natural events. They are symptoms of a larger cosmic disturbance, perhaps even a galactic event that is reaching its peak. If this continues unchecked, we could be facing a planetary collapse, and the rivers, the heart of life on Earth, are the first to bear the brunt of it. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the enormity of the situation hit her. The disruption of the magnetic poles wasn't just a physical phenomenon. It was tied to a deeper cosmic imbalance, something that was affecting the very fabric of life on Earth. The rivers were not just a reflection of this disruption. They were the first line of defense. If they continued to shift and dry up, the consequences would be catastrophic. We have to act fast, Lena said, her voice firm with resolve. We need to understand the cosmic forces at play here, and we need to find a way to restore the balance before it's too late. Dr. Arthur nodded, his face grim. Agreed. But we can't do this alone. We need to work with the river guardians, with the people who understand the deeper connections between the earth and the cosmos. Together, we may have a chance to reverse the damage. Lena looked at the model of Earth before her, the magnetic lines still shifting in strange patterns. The Earth was in turmoil, but it wasn't just a natural disaster. This was a cosmic event, one that threatened not only the rivers, but the very foundation of life on this planet. As she gazed at the swirling energy fields on the screen, Lena knew the clock was ticking. The Earth's balance was tipping, and it was up to them to find a way to restore it before everything was lost. The coastal town where Lena had grown up was on the brink of disaster. The river, which had once been the lifeblood of the community, had grown restless. It surged and swirled unnaturally, swollen with the rainwater and the broken remnants of its own path. A massive flood was fast approaching, threatening to swallow the town whole. The people in the streets moved in a flurry of panic, gathering their belongings and preparing for the worst. The familiar streets, which Lena had known since childhood, were now filled with an ominous sense of urgency. Lena stood at the edge of the river, feeling the warm wind whip through her hair. Beside her, Dr. Arthur was scanning his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. The river, once a calm and peaceful body of water, had become a beast, twisting and raging like a living entity. "This is worse than we thought," Dr. Arthur muttered, pointing at the screen. "The river's flow is moving in completely unpredictable directions. The floodwaters are going to reach the town much faster than we anticipated." Lena clenched her fists. This was no longer just about saving her town. It was about saving the entire river system. Over the past few weeks, she had learned more than she ever wanted to about how interconnected everything was. The rivers were more than just bodies of water. They were conduits of life, carriers of the Earth's energy, and the balance between nature and human civilization. If they were destroyed, nothing would be safe. But Lena refused to give up. She turned to the river guardians, who had arrived just hours before the flood hit. Their leader, an elderly indigenous woman named Ayana, was standing by the riverbank, her face calm despite the chaos around her. The river guardians had brought their knowledge of the natural world, how to harness the forces of nature, how to work with the earth's rhythms rather than against them. But they also brought with them ancient wisdom, teachings passed down through generations, about the power of the rivers and the forces that shape them. "Ayana, what can we do?" Lena asked, her voice urgent. "The flood is coming faster than we thought. We need to restore the flow before it's too late." Ayana looked at the river, her eyes filled with a deep, knowing sadness. "The flow has been disturbed. We must restore it, not just the water, but the balance. The earth is speaking to us, Lena. It is telling us to listen." Lena felt the weight of her words, but she was no stranger to urgency. The river guardians had already shared some of their ancient methods, which Lena and Dr. Arthur had adapted with modern technology. Together, they had devised a plan, a desperate attempt to heal the river before it was too late. "We will use natural barriers," Ayana said, pointing to a series of trees and plants along the riverbank. "These trees, these roots, they once held the river's path in place. We will replant them. But we also need something more." Lena nodded. She understood. They needed to combine the ancient methods with the cutting-edge technology they had developed. Helios Base, the research facility from the mountains, had provided them with a series of magnetic field disruptors that could help stabilize the Earth's energy in the area, allowing the river's flow to settle into a more natural course. But this would require a delicate balance, too much energy, and they risked further destabilizing the system. As the storm clouds gathered above, Lena, Dr. Arthur, and the river guardians worked together to prepare. The magnetic disruptors were set up along the riverbanks, and the trees were replanted in strategic areas where their roots could help redirect the flow of the river. The guardians, their voices low in chant, began to call upon the earth's ancient energy, while Lena monitored the readings from the disruptors. The whole town held its breath. But then, just as they were about to make their final adjustments, the ground beneath their feet trembled. A distant rumble echoed through the valley, growing louder with each passing second. Lena turned to see the corporation's machinery moving closer, a fleet of dredgers and diggers, clearing the river's path for a new industrial development. The same corporation that had caused so much destruction to the river, the one Lena had been tracking for months, was now directly in their way. "Stop!" Lena shouted, running toward the massive machines. "You're destroying everything. Stop!" The men inside the machines barely looked up. The flood had already begun, and the corporation was determined to continue their operations despite the danger. Dr. Arthur rushed to her side. "Lena, we can't stop them here. They'll just keep coming." But Lena's resolve was unwavering. She marched straight toward the lead engineer, a tall man wearing a hard hat, who stood with his arms crossed, overseeing the machinery. "Do you know what you're doing?" she demanded. "The rivers are shifting because of your actions. You are destroying everything, our towns, our ecosystems, and the earth itself." The engineer smirked. "This is progress, miss. We need to expand, and this flood, well, it's just nature doing its thing. We can fix it once we're done." Lena's heart pounded. She knew she had to make them understand, but words alone wouldn't do it. She pulled out the data she had gathered, the maps, the evidence, the findings from Helios Base. She handed it to the engineer. "You think this is just a flood, just a natural event? It's a warning, a message from the earth itself. And if you don't stop, the river will be gone forever, along with everything that depends on it. Your machines won't fix this. They'll only make it worse." The engineer hesitated, his eyes scanning the data. For a moment, Lena thought he might dismiss it, but then something in his expression shifted. He looked at her, and for the first time, Lena saw doubt in his eyes. "We can't afford to lose this project," he said quietly, as if trying to justify himself. "And you can't afford to lose the planet," Lena replied. Finally, After a tense silence, the engineer nodded. He signaled to his team to shut down the machines. The hum of the dredgers died down, and the men climbed out of their vehicles looking uneasy. Lena didn't waste any time. She rushed back to the riverbank, where Ayana and the guardians were waiting. Together, they activated the magnetic disruptors, guiding the river back to its natural course. Slowly but surely, the water began to settle, the frantic flow calming as the energy from the earth itself stabilized. The river was healing. It was returning to its ancient path. As the floodwaters receded, the town began to breathe again. The air was still heavy with tension, but the worst was over. The river had been restored, its course once again flowing freely, and Lena stood at its banks, watching the water move steadily forward. For the first time in weeks, Lena felt a sense of peace wash over her. They had done it. They had saved the river and perhaps the planet itself. The battle had been hard, but the victory was sweet. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the restored river, Lena knew this was only the beginning. The earth had shown them its strength, but it was now up to humanity to honor that strength and keep the balance intact.